They were prevented from recognizing him. He said to them, "What are you talking about as you walk along?" They stopped, their faces downcast. The one named Cleopas replied, "Are you the only visitor to Jerusalem who is unaware of the things that have taken place there over the last few days?" He said to them, "What things?" They said to him, "The things about Jesus of Nazareth. Because of his powerful deeds and words, he was recognized by God and all the people as a prophet. But the chief priests and our leaders handed him over to be sentenced to death, and they crucified him. We had hoped he was the one who would redeem Israel. All these things happened 3 days ago. But there's more. Some women from our group have left us stunned. They went to the tomb early this morning and didn't find his body. They came to us saying that they had even seen a vision of angels who told them he is alive. Some of those who were with us went to the tomb and found things just as the women said. They didn't see him." Then Jesus said to them, "You foolish people, your dull minds keep you from believing all that the prophets talked about. Wasn't it necessary for the Christ to suffer these things and then enter into his glory?" Then he interpreted for them the things written about himself in all the scriptures, starting with Moses, as going through all the prophets. When they came to Emmaus, he acted as if he was going on ahead. But they urged him, saying, "Stay with us. It's nearly evening, and the day is almost over." So he went in to stay with them. After he took his seat at the table with them, he took the bread, blessed and broke it, and gave it to them. Their eyes were opened, and they recognized him, but he disappeared from their sight. And they said to each other, "Weren't our hearts on fire when he spoke to us along the road and when he explained the scriptures for us?" They got right up and returned to Jerusalem. They found the 11 and their companions gathered together. They were saying to each other, "The Lord really has risen. He appeared to Simon." Then the 2 disciples described what had happened along the road and how Jesus was made known to them as he broke the bread. The word of the Lord.
Thanks be to God. So I've been a lifelong disciple. In fact, at least 3rd generation and maybe further back. This is kind of in my blood and in my roots. But for being a lifelong disciple, I haven't always served disciple congregations. In fact, my last call, I was serving a congregation, the United Church of Christ, north of Chicago. And they came out of the old evangelical synod of the Lutheran Church, if you go far enough back through merger. And so their traditions, I'll just say they're a little bit different from ours, might be an understatement. They're quite a bit different from ours. And some of their practices are a little different too. So I sometimes found myself in a bit of a predicament when I would go to make shut-in visits. Because one of the 2 changes you'll note from their approach to ministry and ours is that while you all could come up and have the elders and the deacons do everything at the communion table without my presence at all. In fact, I grew up in a disciple church where the minister sat and watched the entire communion service. In the United Church of Christ, they expect an authorized minister to be present at the table. In fact, the only way that the elements can be truly and fully blessed is if they are presided over by an authorized, whether ordained or licensed minister in their tradition. So one of the things that we quickly came to understand was when the communion needed to go to the shut-ins, we didn't send our elders, we sent me. Because I was authorized. And even though I told them, well, in my tradition, you all can do this. And even though I told them, and in your tradition, I can apparently bless this, and you could do this, needless to say, that never happened. So I find myself taking my shut-in to the communions. It was a smaller church. There weren't as many of them. But I was also in this tradition. One of the other major differences is, while we have, not universally, but most of the way across the board in our denomination, we've adopted the use of grape juice rather than wine at the table. In the United Church of Christ, it's much more of a mixed bag. And particularly in these older German-rooted traditions, in a German church like mine that still did worship in German right up until World War I, you can imagine where this is going. Their communion service was done with wine. And so the expectation for our shut-ins varied, and it was a balancing act. You have to be responsible with this, although yes, you're only taking just a little bit. Some of these folks I know are on medications, some of them on multiple medications, and we all know that once you get to that position where somebody is taking multiple medications for multiple things, there's always a chance for cross reactions and unexpected symptoms. And the last thing you're told to do in these scenarios would be to add alcohol. Well, needless to say, one day I was going to visit one of my shut-ins, and let's just call her Jean for the purposes of our discussion today. And that Sunday I knew that I should have taken her grape juice, but I was actually making 2 visits, and I wasn't thinking, and the other one would have been all right. So I took my kit and I prepared it with the wine. And I took it to my first shut-in, and we had a nice conversation, and we prayed, and we shared the elements. And then I went down the hall to Joan, and I had that moment of, I know better. I'm supposed to bring the juice for her. Well, we'll make this work. We will go in on trust. And so we went and we settled in, and the conversation was livelier than normal. Joan she was in assisted living and special care because she was having issues with memory, and sometimes my visits would be very short. She wasn't necessarily always responsive or necessarily in a mood to converse, but today she was ready to speak. And so I brought in the elements, and I went through the process of blessing them, and I said a quick extra prayer, and I handed them to her, and we partook of them. And after we were done, what had been a fairly coherent conversation took an interesting slip for just a moment, because she finished her cup, and she looked at me and said, well, that was nice, but I would have preferred a white. And is it sad that my mind immediately went to, but how would I keep it chilled? Needless to say that I lost all of my composure in that moment and managed to suppress most of the laugh into a chuckle, and I smiled at her and I said, well, we'll see what I can do next time. But that day we had this lively conversation that took some unexpected turns, but we shared these holy moments around the breaking of a simple wafer and the sharing of the cup. And I left that place having walked in maybe a little anxious, maybe a little uncertain, but I left that place having felt that something holy had happened there. And in that moment, I had experienced the presence of Christ in a way that I hadn't expected and sometimes don't always necessarily feel when I'm visiting with Joan, because some days she's not ready to engage. But in this moment we shared a beautiful time. And I talked with her longer than that day than I had in many visits. And we enjoyed that moment. It's part of the reason I was drawn to today's story. And between this story in Luke and last week's story in the final chapter of John, where Jesus appears to the disciples who are out fishing, these are my two very favorite resurrection stories because they have so much to tell us today about our experience of God and our calling to continue to live not only in God's presence, but to invoke God's presence. I love this story because we have two disciples leaving the city of Jerusalem and traveling down the Jericho road on their way home. And they're leaving. This is a few weeks after Easter, but as the story tells us, this is Easter day, and they are departing. They had not really heard any of the news. They just knew Jesus had been crucified, and they're going home with heavy hearts thinking, we thought he was the one, and now he's gone. And then the stranger sidles up to them along the road, and he asks them, why the droopy faces? Why are you so downtrodden? And so they begin to share the crucifixion story with him. And I love that because this is where it turns. It begins with them sharing the crucifixion story with Jesus, and it ends with him sharing the resurrection story with them. Because as he listens to them sharing this, he starts to enter into the conversation, and he starts to interpret scriptures, and he starts to tell the story of what is happening, and even to the point of going, can't you all see? I love the description in Luke. How foolish are you guys? Don't you get it? This was all supposed to happen. And as the day is nearing the end, we get that typical disciple-type response, even though they weren't one of the 12, of, well, this is interesting, but I'm not sure if we've got it yet. And we're about home, but where are you going? It's growing dark. Why don't you come in and stay with us? This is what good hospitality people would do. Come, share a meal, and stay the night. We'll provide you lodging and food and rest before you continue on your way in the morning. So the unknown Jesus joins them, and he enters into this space, and I love it. I love it. I kind of imagine them setting the table as Jesus quietly watches. And then once the table is prepared, the cup has been brought forth, the bread has been laid out, the food is settled, I imagine him just kind of standing up and walking over and taking over for them and picking up the loaf and blessing it. And then pouring out the cup and picking it up and blessing it. And then in that moment, this unexpected stranger who wasn't supposed to be preparing the meal, they were being hospitable to him, turned that table around and showed them Christian hospitality, Christ's hospitality. For he took that meal and he turned it into communion. For in that blessing it says that their eyes were opened, and all of a sudden they recognized the presence of the Christ in their living room at their table. And then he disappeared from their place, disappeared from their sight. Now it's a little confusing because it says then they turned around and they went back to Jerusalem. And I don't know if that means they went ahead and ate and slept and they went back the next morning when it was safe, or if they all skedaddled back in the dark, which would not have been the wisest decision that they could have made. But it says they went back and they shared this story then with the 12 disciples and with other followers. And they said it was amazing. We talked and we studied and we learned from him as he interpreted scriptures and as he brought the word to us. But then it was at the table that we finally realized that God was present in the breaking of bread. But oh, how our hearts burned within us, and we didn't even know it until he was gone. So I asked our young Christians about whether they've seen Jesus this morning, because I haven't seen him yet, not in person. In fact, I can't even say that I've seen an apparition or a ghostly vision, because we don't really know in this story. There's no physical engagement, no embracing, no touching. We just know that there was a presence and that God was felt amongst them. But I know that even if I don't encounter the bodily Christ somewhere along the road, Even if I don't see some spectral, ghost-like image that I may not be able to touch or embrace, but I know it's Christ. Even if I don't have that, I know when Christ has been present. Because afterwards, I recognize the way that my heart burned within me. And I recognize the way that Christ was made present through simple acts that reminded us of our call to gather, to dine together, to fellowship with one another, and to invoke God's presence in our midst. In many ways, this is our calling. It's not just to head out and walk home 2 by 2 so that we can experience Christ with one another. It's not just to come here into this worship space and experience Christ together, but it's to go out as followers of the way of Jesus so that when we encounter others, now that 2 or more are gathered, we might find ways to invoke the presence of God with them and become the Christ that we see others needing. It's a happy accident in some ways that the scriptures were scheduled such that I would bring this message and preach on this reading from Luke today. And last week, as part of our 100-year histories, we heard a story about table fellowship and the importance of meals in the life of our church. And that today, Rachel would come and be with us and share with us the importance of sharing meals with the men at the Benedict house. I don't know whether any of you all who were there this time, or any of you all who have been there and done this in the past, I don't know if you left and you felt that burning in your hearts, or that presence of Christ made alive in you in ways that you might not have noticed in the moment, but the last time I was there, I did. I didn't notice it at first, but after I left, I knew something holy had happened in that moment, and that through the simple act of sharing and serving a meal, God was made present. Maybe they needed God to be present. Maybe they just needed the meal to be present. Maybe they just needed somebody to show up and offer that recognition that there are people outside and in the world who care and are concerned about you, and that we're concerned about each other. Whatever it was, Christ was there. And I trust that we go out to be present to others so that Christ can be there. We may never notice it. We may not feel it. But I wonder if we ever look back and recognize that the fires were burning within our hearts. May we wander on the roads that carry us forth this week. And may we encounter and may we offer Christ to one another in everything we do. Amen? Amen. Amen.